In the forgotten corners of Asia, where jungle roots crack ancient stone, where monks chant to spirits no one sees, and where stories are passed down not in books, but in whispers, there lies a truth that never died. Welcome to Whispers of Asia. Here we do not tell tales, we unearth them, buried beneath temple ruins, bound in red string, sealed behind shrine doors that were never meant to open again. Tonight, we journey to the mist-shrouded village of Thung, to a crumbling temple that no longer exists on maps, to a ritual older than prayer, where the lonely call to the dead, and the dead answer. This is not a story about love. It is a story about what answers when love turns to desperation. Light your incense, tie your thread, and don't look behind you. This is the tale of the red string at Wat Bon Thung.
The road to Thung was barely more than a suggestion on the map, just a thin gray line that disappeared into the folds of jungle and mist. Karn stared out the window of the minibus, her cheek pressed to the glass, watching as the trees grew denser and the light began to change. The sun, once bright and warm, had dulled into a thick white haze that clung to the road like breath on a mirror. She hadn't planned to come here, not really. It was one of those impulsive decisions, born out of sleepless nights, abandoned research, and the kind of loneliness that settled deep into the bones. Her thesis on spiritual remnants in abandoned Southeast Asian temples had stalled. Her advisor had gone silent. Her boyfriend, no, ex-boyfriend, had replaced her faster than she thought humanly possible, and suddenly, the quiet pull of an obscure village near the Laotian border had seemed like an invitation. The driver didn't speak much. He hadn't even asked for her name. He just glanced at her in the mirror once, adjusted the rosary beads hanging from his rear view, and kept driving without another word. The radio played faint Moorlam music, distorted by static. The air smelled of lemongrass, gasoline, and something else. Something damp and earthen, like rotting leaves and incense left too long in a sealed box. As the vehicle rattled past fields half swallowed by fog, Karn caught sight of scarecrows in the distance. But they were strange, not made of straw, but of rags and painted faces. Each one had a red thread tied around its neck, fluttering faintly in the breeze like a warning. The driver spoke for the first time. "Thung," he muttered, pointing ahead without turning. The minibus slowed to a stop near a rusted sign almost obscured by moss and creeping vines. The Thai characters were faded, but Karn could still make out the name. Thung. Thung. She stepped out with her backpack slung over one shoulder, boots crunching against gravel and mud. The minibus was already gone before she turned around. The village looked suspended, like it had been paused mid-breath. Houses made of teak and bamboo leaned slightly to one side, as though tired. Laundry hung from porches, but no one came out. Dogs barked in the distance, but she saw no children, no motorbikes, no vendors, just the mist curling like fingers around her ankles. She found the guest house easily. A sign carved into a plank of wood hung askew above the door. Chanapa Homestay. A woman in her 60s opened the door without a smile. Her eyes scanned Karn's face, her backpack, then the recorder tucked under her arm. "City girl," she said quietly, not a question. She stepped aside, letting Karn in without further word. The air inside smelled of betel nut, jasmine, and something faintly metallic, like copper. Karn set her things down and glanced at the faded portrait hanging above the altar,
an old man in monk robes with completely white eyes. "Stay out of the jungle after sundown," she said, "and don't go near the temple." Karn turned. "There's a temple?" "Not anymore," she replied. "It breathes, but it's dead." That night, Karn lay on the hard mattress, listening to the insects scream outside the wooden slats of the window. She thought of the red strings on the scarecrows, the blind-eyed portrait above the altar, the silent villagers. Her phone had no signal, but she wasn't surprised. Part of her had wanted it this way. No one asking questions, no one checking in. She fell asleep to the sound of bells. Not the musical kind, but the dull clink of metal against stone, like something swaying gently in an underground room. In her dream, she stood at the edge of the forest. Fog clung to her skin like sweat. A trail of red string stretched into the trees, tied to her wrist. On the other end, hidden by mist, was a figure, not moving, just waiting. Karn couldn't see his face, but she felt his smile stretched too wide. She woke gasping, hand clenched, heart pounding, and found her fingers curled tightly around something soft. A piece of faded red string. She hadn't packed any. The next morning, the fog hadn't lifted. She walked into the center of Thung, asking gently about the temple. Most of the villagers looked away, shook their heads, or muttered, "No temple here." But one child, barefoot, holding a lotus pod like a toy, pointed into the forest. "Wat Thung," he said. "The Red Bride Temple." Karn followed the path he had pointed to. The trees grew thicker with each step. Vines dragged against her backpack. Birds didn't sing here. The silence was padded like sound had been swallowed. Then, at the edge of a clearing, she saw it, or what was left of it. The temple was half consumed by the jungle. Stone pillars stood cracked and leaning. The roof was missing. An old bell hung from a broken beam, swaying without wind. Its sound was a dull metallic moan, almost like breathing. The sign above the gate had long since rotted, but one thing remained untouched. A single red string, tied in a perfect knot to the altar's cracked foundation. Karn stood still for a long time. Something in her chest ached, not with fear, but with recognition, like she had been here before, like she had always been walking to this place.
Karn stood at the threshold of the ruin, barely breathing. The jungle pressed in around the old temple like it was trying to reclaim something sacred or suppress something cursed. Vines as thick as wrists wrapped around the skeletal remnants of the walls, climbing over faded murals and decaying Buddha statues, their eyes scratched out or swallowed by moths. The scent of the place was overwhelming. Not the wild green smell of forest, but something sweeter and older, like dried blood and incense. She stepped inside. The moment her foot touched the stone floor, the air shifted. It was as if the ruin exhaled, hot, damp air rising from beneath the earth, curling around her ankles. A soft moan echoed through the pillars. Karn froze. It wasn't the wind. It sounded like breath, human breath. No bird song, no insects, no leaves moving. Only the sound of stone inhaling. She forced herself forward, voice recorder in hand. Each step was careful, deliberate. The central altar stood cracked but still intact, its platform worn smooth by time and touch. Around it, half buried in the earth, were dozens of small figurines, dolls made of clay, faces painted with red smiles, their limbs bound in faded thread. She knelt by one. It was shaped like a woman, with hair carved into the clay and eyes marked with soot.
Around its neck, a strip of red string was tied in 3 knots, then looped around its torso. Karn picked it up gently. It was damp, still warm. Something rustled behind her. She turned, but nothing moved. The vines on the walls seemed to pulse, expanding and retracting, as if the temple itself was breathing slowly, in rhythm with something buried deep below. She stepped closer to the altar, her heart racing. A rusted offering bowl sat on the platform, filled with wilted flower petals, broken teeth, and what looked like old wedding rings. One of them still had a fragment of skin caught beneath it. Karn felt bile rise in her throat, but she forced it down. She wasn't here to be frightened. She was here to understand. That was what she told herself. That was what she had always told herself, even when her work led her to graveyards that reeked of sorrow and shrines where mothers wept without faces. But this place, this was different. It didn't feel forgotten. It felt patient. She moved around the altar and found the base partially collapsed. A small recess had formed beneath it, like a hollow grave. Peering inside, she saw something tucked deep within the shadows, an old clay jar, half shuttered, its lid sealed with red wax. She reached for it. The wax cracked beneath her fingers with a sound like brittle bone. Inside was a spool of red string, its fibers still rich in color, unnaturally untouched by rot or time. Wrapped around it was a folded piece of cloth, inscribed with letters from a forgotten dialect, Northern, old, possibly Tai Lue, or older still. Her fingers tingled as she held it. Then she felt it, a gentle pull, not from the air, not from her mind, from the string itself. It was subtle at first, like static clinging to her wrist. Then it grew, a tension in the thread that had no logical source. The string pulled once, then stopped. She dropped it and staggered back, breath caught in her throat. The jungle outside had grown darker. She hadn't been there long, maybe 20 minutes, but the sun was already gone. She packed the string and the cloth into her bag, heart pounding. The forest trail back to the village seemed longer, more narrow, the branches clawing at her sleeves. Several times she heard footsteps behind her, but when she turned, the path was empty. She didn't run. Not yet, but she walked faster. When she returned to the guest house, her hands were trembling. She tried to tell herself it was the thrill of discovery, a breakthrough, real, tangible evidence of pre-Buddhist animist rituals. But in her chest, she felt something else, like she had awakened something. The old woman was waiting at the door. "You went," she said softly. Not angry, just resigned. Karn nodded, unsure why she suddenly felt so small. The woman stepped aside. "It watches now. You should not have touched it." Karn opened her mouth to speak, to ask questions, but the woman was already walking away, muttering a chant under her breath, fingers brushing the amulet around her neck. That night, Karn couldn't sleep. The string sat coiled inside her bag, but she swore she could hear it moving, rustling, breathing. She turned on her recorder and whispered a note. "Found object beneath altar, red string, feels warm to the touch, possibly ritual tool, possible link to spirit marriage practices referenced in Burmese Thai folklore. We'll document further tomorrow." She paused. Then, without thinking, she added, "It pulled me. Something pulled me." She didn't remember falling asleep, but she dreamed again. She was standing in the temple ruins, only now they were whole again, clean, gold leaf shining on the walls, incense burning in tall bronze jars. Monks in crimson robes stood in a circle around her, eyes closed, chanting words that echoed into her bones. At the center stood a man. She couldn't see his face, only the outline, tall, still, dressed in burial robes. His head was tilted slightly, like he was listening.
His hand was raised, and from his fingers, a red string stretched toward her. She tried to speak, but her lips wouldn't move. He smiled. She woke gasping, heart hammering. The room was freezing. Her bag was open on the floor, and the red string was tied around her wrist, just once. A simple loop, as if something was testing the fit. Morning light crept weakly through the slats of the wooden shutters, spilling over the uneven floorboards like pale water. Karn sat at the small table in her room, staring at her wrist. The faint red mark was still there, soft, circular, like a thread had rested too long against the skin. She told herself it was a dream, that she had tied it herself without realizing, that exhaustion and humidity were twisting her perception. But the string, it wasn't in her bag anymore. It was gone. The air in the guest house felt heavier today. The old woman moved slower than before, muttering prayers as she sprinkled salt along the doorway. When Karn tried to ask about the temple, she only replied, "What's buried beneath is not meant to be touched." Then she spat 3 times toward the floorboards and walked away. Karn stepped outside, clutching her camera and notebook. The fog still lingered over the rice paddies, thicker than before, muffling the world into silence. Crows perched on the roof of the empty schoolhouse, unmoving. The child she'd met yesterday was nowhere to be found. She followed the forest path again, her shoes sinking into the damp earth. The temple waited where she'd left it, as if time refused to pass there. The air inside was cool, unmoving, filled with the faint hum of something unseen. She traced her fingers along the stone walls, following the worn carvings until she reached the stupa behind the main altar. It leaned precariously to one side, its base split open by roots. Something inside gleamed faintly beneath the dust. She knelt, brushing away soil and insects. The hollow of the stupa revealed a small opening, blocked by a piece of carved wood. When she pulled it free, a cascade of dry petals and brittle bones spilled into her lap. Among them lay a sealed clay pot, its surface etched with symbols she didn't recognize, loops and spirals, repeating like prayers. The lid had been glued shut with black resin. Her pulse quickened. She took a deep breath, steadying her hands, then cracked it open. The smell was overwhelming. Old ashes, salt, and something faintly sweet, like burnt honey. Inside, wrapped in layers of thin cloth, was a stack of palm leaf manuscripts, bound together with red string that crumbled at her touch. The script was ancient. She could recognize fragments, Lana, Taiyuan, but the words were older than any dialect still spoken. She laid them out carefully on the stone, brushing off the dust. One line repeated again and again across the pages, written in thicker ink than the rest. Pithi Thung Nang Mal, the spirit marriage rite. Her breath caught. She had read mentions of it before, in fragmented research from Northern Thai archives, vague accounts of marriages between the living and the dead, meant to appease vengeful spirits, often performed by women who had lost their lovers to war or plague. But there was something different in this text. This wasn't just ritual, it was devotion. She turned the pages slowly, translating phrases aloud. To bind the heart of the living to the heart of the lost. To tie what the grave has stolen. To offer breath to the forgotten, that he may breathe again through you. On the bottom of the final leaf, she found a warning. He who was buried beneath the altar must never be called by name, for the string remembers the voice that awakens him. Her throat tightened. The manuscript wasn't describing a symbolic union. It was literal, a conjuring. She lifted the last palm leaf and froze. Beneath it was something unexpected, an old photograph, faded and water-stained. It showed a man in monk's robes standing before the same temple decades earlier. His face was calm,
almost serene, but his eyes were closed, sewn shut with red thread. The back of the photograph bore a single line of script: Pra-yat. That night, back at the guest house, Karn copied the text by hand, her mind spinning. She felt both fear and fascination, an intoxicating pull she couldn't name. When she closed her notebook, she realized she was smiling without meaning to. The corners of her mouth hurt. The room grew colder. She lit a candle, the flame trembling with each breath she took. On impulse, she played the recording from the previous day, the one she'd made inside the temple. At first, only the sound of her footsteps and shallow breathing filled the speaker. Then came a whisper, soft, male. "You found me." The recorder slipped from her hand and hit the floor with a hollow click. She stared at it, trembling. The air around her seemed to move, slow and deliberate, like someone was breathing beside her ear. Karn crawled across the floor and turned the recorder off. The silence that followed felt wrong, too empty. She could hear her own heartbeat pounding in her ears. She turned to the window and froze. In the reflection of the glass, there was movement. Someone stood behind her, just out of focus, a tall figure, blurred by the flickering candlelight. She spun around, but the room was empty. The candle went out. Karn sat in the dark, listening. The only sound was the faint scraping of something dragging across the wooden floor. Then, from the corner of the room, a soft click. Her camera had turned itself on. Through the viewfinder, the lens focused slowly on the far wall, and there, where no one stood, the red string hung suspended in the air, stretched tight, as if being held from the other side. It twitched once, then snapped. Karn screamed, stumbling backward. The sound echoed through the house, startling birds from the roof outside. The old woman burst into the room moments later, clutching a talisman and chanting under her breath. When she saw the string lying broken on the floor, her face turned pale. "He's awake," she whispered. "You've broken the seal." Karn tried to speak, but her voice trembled. Who is he?" The old woman's eyes glistened with tears. "Pra-yat," she said, "the monk who fell in love with a dancer. They buried him alive beneath the altar to silence his sin." She turned slowly toward Karn, her expression heavy with pity and dread. "And now, you've called him home." The candle reignited suddenly with a hiss, burning brighter than before. For a heartbeat, she thought she saw a face flicker in the flame, a man's face, calm, smiling. The light swelled, then died. When the room fell back into darkness, she was alone again, but the smell of burnt honey lingered in the air. And in the faint glow of the ember wick, she saw it, her notebook, open to the page with the ritual. Someone had written a new line beneath it in wet, red ink. "The string remembers." The sky over Thung looked heavy that evening, as if the clouds themselves were suffocating. The air was thick enough to taste. Karn walked the narrow path back toward the temple, her breath shallow, her hands trembling slightly from lack of sleep. For 2 nights she hadn't rested, not since hearing that voice on her recorder, not since the old woman whispered the monk's name like a curse. Pra-yat. The syllables lingered on her tongue like smoke, heavy and sweet. She should have left. Every rational part of her said so, but rationality had begun to decay here, in this place where the air itself seemed to breathe, where the nights whispered her name through the fog. Curiosity had turned into something else, an ache she couldn't define, something between longing and dread. By the time she reached the temple ruins, the light was fading. Cicadas screamed from the trees, then fell abruptly silent as if the forest was holding its breath. She set her camera and notebook on a flat stone and took out the manuscript pages she had transcribed. Her eyes followed the instructions again and again until the words blurred into rhythm, into chant. The text described the act in chilling simplicity. To awaken the forgotten, tie the red string between the living and the buried heart. Speak his name only once, and he will know you. The red string lay coiled in her palm, soft and warm despite the cooling air. She looped one end around her left ring finger. The knot tightened easily, almost eagerly, and she exhaled, trying to ignore the way the thread seemed to pulse faintly against her skin. Documenting ritual reconstruction based on Northern Thai script, purpose symbolic reenactment, not invocation. But she wasn't convincing anyone, not even herself. The altar loomed before her, cracked and blackened by age. She tied the other end of the string around a jagged piece of its foundation, the stone cold and damp beneath her fingers. The jungle was utterly still. Her voice trembled as she began to recite the words. The dialect was rough on her tongue, but the rhythm felt ancient, instinctive, like the sound of something older than memory. She didn't know what she was saying, not truly, but her heart raced faster with every phrase until the air around her began to shift. The candle beside her flickered once, twice. Then the wind stopped entirely. The silence pressed in, thick and suffocating. She could hear her pulse in her ears, her breath echoing against the hollow stone. And then, the string moved. Just slightly, a tug, so gentle she almost missed it. Karn froze. Her eyes darted to the altar. The red thread was trembling. It wasn't the wind. It was something deliberate, slow, testing. Another pull, stronger this time. The candle flame twisted sideways, bending toward the altar as if drawn by breath. Her voice recorder crackled suddenly, though she hadn't touched it. Then came a low whisper, male, soft, close enough to feel on her neck. "You tied it wrong." The words were almost kind. Almost. Karn staggered back, gasping, Who's there?" The candle sputtered violently and went out. For a moment she was swallowed by blackness so complete that she could hear her heartbeat echo against the temple walls. When the light returned, faint, pale, not from the candle, but from somewhere beneath the altar, she saw it. A hand. Pale gray skin, the color of wet ash, protruding just slightly from the hollow beneath the stone. The fingers twitched once before vanishing into the shadows. Karn stumbled backward, clutching her wrist, the red string cutting deep into her flesh. The knot wouldn't come undone. She pulled at it until her skin burned, but the thread only grew tighter. Then the whisper came again, soft and calm, from directly behind her. "You found me." She turned. Nothing. The air felt charged, vibrating faintly like the moment before a storm. She could smell it now, the faint scent of burnt honey, the same she'd noticed from the manuscript jar. It filled her nose, thick and sweet enough to make her eyes water. The jungle came alive, all at once. Crickets screamed, frogs croaked. The wind rushed through the trees with sudden violence, carrying faint voices, chanting, laughing, crying, all at once, a cacophony of the dead returning to song. Karn fell to her knees, hands pressed over her ears. "Stop!" she cried out. "Please stop!" The wind obeyed. Just like that. Silence again. The thread loosened just slightly. She stared at it through tears. The knot around her finger had darkened, no longer red, but almost black, as if ink had soaked through it. Somewhere deep within the earth beneath the temple, something shifted. It sounded like soil collapsing inward, or something pushing upward. Karn didn't remember running back to the village. She only remembered bursting through the door of the guest house, breathless, her hands shaking so violently she dropped her recorder. The old woman was waiting again, as if she knew this would happen. "You tied it," the woman said, not a question. Her eyes were full of sorrow. I had to see. I had to know if it was real." "It's real," the woman interrupted sharply, "and now it knows you are real." The words struck her harder than any shout. That night, Karn sat on the bed watching the candlelight flicker against the walls. Every shadow in the room looked wrong, elongated, watching her. At some point, she drifted into half-sleep. In the dream, she was standing in front of the altar again, the string stretched from her hand into the darkness. At the other end stood a figure, tall and thin, dressed in the robes of a monk, his head bowed. She tried to speak, but her mouth wouldn't open. The figure slowly lifted his head. His eyes were sewn shut with red thread, yet somehow she knew he was looking at her. When he smiled, she saw teeth, too many, too sharp. He held out his hand. The red string began to shorten between them, inch by inch, pulling her closer until she could smell the earth on his robes, the damp rot of something long buried. He whispered one word, soft and final, "Wife." Karn woke screaming. Her hand flew to her wrist, bleeding now, the skin torn where the string had been, but the thread was gone. In its place, a faint scar, a ring, as if something had claimed her. She turned on her recorder again with shaking hands. Her voice was barely a whisper. "Day 4. I think the ritual worked, or maybe I'm losing my mind. Either way, he's here." She didn't notice it until later, when she played the recording back. Between her words, faint but unmistakable, another voice spoke. "I never left." Karn didn't remember falling asleep, only waking to the heavy weight of silence pressed against her chest. It was still dark. The shadows in the corners of the room felt thicker somehow, as if something had moved within them during the night and settled there, watching. Her wrist throbbed. When she pulled up the sleeve, she saw it again, faint but clearer now. A ring, a perfect circle of broken capillaries just beneath the skin, as though something had branded her from the inside. She rose from bed slowly, careful not to make a sound. The floorboards creaked under her bare feet as she walked to the sink and splashed water on her face. But when she looked up into the mirror, her reflection didn't move. She froze. It was only for a moment, just a second of delay, but her own face had stared back without blinking, mouth slightly parted, head tilted at an angle she never made. Then it mirrored her again, flawless, silent, empty. She backed away, breath catching in her throat. The water continued to drip from the faucet in irregular, uneven taps, like footsteps in a distant hallway. That morning, she noticed the villagers looking at her differently. Their eyes no longer showed simple disapproval. Now they held something worse, pity and fear. A boy selling betel leaves turned away when he saw her. A woman with a basket of eels crossed the road to avoid her shadow. One man muttered a single phrase under his breath as he passed. "Bride of ashes." Karn gripped the strap of her satchel and kept walking. She made her way to the temple again. She didn't plan to. Her legs moved without decision, as if something was drawing her. And when she arrived, she saw that the altar had changed. There, in the hollow beneath it, was an offering bowl that hadn't been there before. Inside it, 2 lotus buds, a cracked ivory comb, and something that made her stomach drop. A toothbrush. A new one. Clean, pale pink. Exactly like hers. Someone had left it for her, or with her. She backed away slowly and turned for home. Back at the guest house, the old woman was gone. No note, no trace. The front door hung slightly open. Karn stepped inside, calling her name. The house was silent, but everything was still in place, except for one thing. On the small table by the bed was a second toothbrush, identical, still wet. She stared at it for a long time. That night, she slept with the recorder running, tucked under her pillow. The candlelight flickered against the walls, and her eyes refused to close, hovering just at the edge of sleep. At some point, she didn't remember when, she slipped under, and she dreamed. She was in the forest, barefoot, wearing a wedding veil stitched from spider silk. The trees had parted in a circle around the temple, where monks stood in rows, their mouths sewn shut. A figure waited at the altar. He did not speak. He did not move. But she knew. It was him. She stepped forward, compelled by a force that wasn't hers. The red string trailed from her hand, wrapped around his fingers. He lifted it and tied it tighter. Then he reached for her face, brushing her cheek with fingers that were far too cold, too smooth, too dry. He whispered, "Do you accept?" Karn tried to scream, but her mouth was already sewn. She woke, gasping, fingers clawing at her lips. There were no threads, not yet, but there were bruises along her neck, gentle and deliberate, like the touch of hands, and a scent in the air, burnt honey. She grabbed her recorder, rewound the tape, and played it back. At first, only her breath, the rustle of sheets. Then, softly, beneath everything else, a second voice, breathing with her. And then, "You were made for me." The door creaked behind her. She turned, but nothing was there, except the closet door was open. Inside, her clothes, all shifted, rearranged, and, hanging from the inside knob, like a gift, was a folded piece of fabric. She stepped closer and saw what it was. A veil, handmade, old, yellowed by time, but unmistakably bridal. She dropped it and stepped back, trembling. Later that day, she visited the small shrine on the edge of the village, where villagers left offerings to local spirits. The shrine keeper, a hunched man with milky eyes, recognized her instantly. "You're the one who tied it." "I didn't mean—" "It doesn't matter." Karn's voice cracked. "Who was he?" The old man didn't speak for a long time. Then he sighed and motioned for her to sit. "He was a novice monk here, long ago. He fell in love with a dancer from another village. Secret meetings, whispered vows. They say he promised her eternity. When the temple elders found out, they accused him of defiling his vow. They buried him alive beneath the altar, so he could never lie again, so his voice would never tempt another." Karn's blood ran cold. They thought it would end the curse, he continued. But you can't bury longing, not forever. She stared at him, barely breathing. Why the red string? He smiled, sadly. Because it's how lovers find each other again. She left the shrine in a daze, her hands numb, her ears ringing. That night, she dreamed again, only this time, she didn't want to wake up. The dream was warm, gentle, a soft voice humming beside her, fingers brushing her hair back. She couldn't see him, but she felt him lie beside her, wrapping an arm around her waist, his breath cold against the nape of her neck. You're not alone now. You'll never be alone again, he whispered, and she smiled in her sleep. And in the darkness of the room, the candlelight flickered. Behind her, the imprint of another body slowly appeared on the bedsheet beside her. Indentation of a head, indentation of a hand, indentation of a body long buried, breathing in unison with hers.
Karn had never liked mirrors. Even as a child, she avoided them at night. Superstitions her grandmother whispered about reflection stealing your soul. But now, it wasn't superstition that made her avoid her own eyes. It was recognition, because the woman who stared back at her every morning looked more and more like a stranger. The smile was always the first thing she noticed. Too wide, too long. Even when her lips were resting, there was a softness to her mouth now, as if something inside her was constantly amused. She didn't remember smiling, but her reflection did. She traced a finger along the corners of her lips. The skin was tender, bruised, as if pulled tight, stretched against her will. Something was wrong with her teeth. They ached. That morning, she found small spots of dried blood on her pillow. When she rinsed her mouth, the water turned faintly pink. Her gums were swollen. She pressed her tongue against her back molars and winced. They were shifting. She forced herself to look into the mirror again. And there, just for a second, she saw them. A second row of teeth. Tiny, sharp, nestled behind the real ones like a child hiding behind its mother's skirt. She blinked, and they were gone. Her breath fogged the mirror. On the glass, her condensation left an outline, an open-mouthed smile, wider than her own. That day, the air in Thung was dry and still. Villagers no longer acknowledged her. Doors shut when she passed. Even the dogs avoided her. A child stared too long and began to cry. Karn didn't blame them. She couldn't hide it anymore. The bruises, the exhaustion, the feeling that her body was no longer fully hers. At night, she caught herself standing by the window without knowing how long she'd been there, waiting, listening. One evening, she sat on the floor of her room with her camera, watching herself through the lens, documenting the subtle shifts in her behavior. Her shoulders rolled back, her chin slightly lowered. Her eyes lingered longer in shadows. Her mouth was often curled into that same silent smile. She rewound the footage and played it again. In the background, she saw her closet door slowly open, but she hadn't moved. She hadn't noticed it. And behind the door, nothing, just blackness. But on the frame, dangling from the inside handle, was another red string. Longer this time, thicker, as if someone or something was braiding it, preparing it. She slept restlessly that night. Her dreams were no longer fragmented. They followed a pattern now, ritualistic, familiar. She stood in a room lit with candles, hundreds of them.
their flames bent toward her like petals toward the sun. She was dressed in white silk, soaked in sweat and earth. Before her stood Fra Yut, his eyes still sown, his smile never blinking. He reached out and placed his hand over her heart. "You are opening," he whispered. "I can feel you blooming." His fingers sank into her skin, not violently, not with pain, but like roots pressing into soil. She didn't scream. She didn't pull away. She only tilted her head and smiled. When she woke, she couldn't remember her own name for a few seconds. It took effort, real effort, to say it aloud. Karn. It felt unfamiliar, like a borrowed word from another language. She wrote it in her notebook again and again just to make it real. Karn, Karn, Karn. Her handwriting changed. She noticed it on the 5th repetition. The loops were tighter. The slant was reversed. She didn't write this way. That afternoon, she returned to the temple again. She didn't bring her recorder. She didn't bring her newts. She brought flowers. She didn't remember picking them, but they were in her hands. 2 white lotus buds, bound in a strip of cloth. She placed them on the altar and bowed her head. And then she heard it. A humming, soft, melancholy, a lullaby in a dialect she didn't know, but understood anyway. She turned slowly, and there he was, Prayut. For the first time, he stood before her fully, not in glimpses, not in dreams. His feet did not touch the ground. His robes drifted like smoke, threads unraveling as they fell. His face was young but wrong, too smooth, skin stretched too tightly across his skull, and his eyes, though sewn shut, bled through the thread, small streaks of red trailing down his cheeks. Still, he smiled. "You are ready," he whispered. Karn tried to speak, but her voice caught. Her throat was dry. Her body felt like stone. "I have waited," he said. "They buried me for loving, but you love without knowing." He lifted a finger, and from his hand a thread unspooled. Red, fresh, vibrating. It danced toward her like a living thing, winding through the air. When it touched her wrist, she felt her breath leave her, not from fear, but from something deeper, a surrender. He stepped forward, hand still raised, and she whispered, "Why me?" His smile widened. "Because you answered." She closed her eyes. When she opened them, he was gone, but the string was tied again around her wrist, 3 knots this time, and her mouth hurt. She walked back to the guest house slowly, swaying as if her body didn't quite belong to her anymore. In the mirror that night, she smiled, and when she did, a single tooth fell into the sink. Her smile didn't change. She watched the blood swirl in the water and felt nothing at all. The string was shorter in the morning. Karn hadn't moved it. She hadn't touched it. But when she awoke, the red thread wrapped around her wrist was tighter, the loose end drawn upward and out of sight, disappearing beneath the folds of her sleeve, through the window, and vanishing into the dense air outside. It pulsed faintly against her skin, warm and alive, as though it had a heartbeat of its own. She stared at it for a long time, afraid to tug. In the corner of the room, the toothbrush was gone. In its place stood a cup of tea, still steaming. She didn't ask who had made it. Her body was changing. She could feel it, not in any violent way, not with sudden pain or bleeding, but with slow, deliberate shifts. Her spine curved differently when she sat. Her mouth, when at rest, hung slightly open, expectant. Her voice had grown softer. She barely spoke anymore. The villagers had stopped looking at her entirely. Even the guest house felt colder, as if the house knew it was sheltering something it didn't understand. That evening, as the sun dropped behind the black line of trees, Karn returned to the temple. She didn't remember walking there. One moment she was in her room, the next she was standing before the altar again. The jungle was completely still, not silent, still. Even the leaves refused to move. She sat on the stone floor and placed her hands in her lap. The thread uncoiled from her wrist, drifting into the air like a puppet string. It pulled her gently forward, toward the altar. She didn't resist. Below the stone, the hollow breathed. She could hear it now. A deep, slow inhalation from under the earth, like a buried heart still trying to remember how to beat. She leaned in, and something whispered her name from below the altar. Soft, familiar, like a lover breathing against her skin. Karn. She didn't move, didn't flinch. Instead, she smiled. That night, the dreams were worse. She stood in her wedding dress, only this time the veil covered her eyes. She couldn't lift it. Her hands were bound. Figures surrounded her, chanting in broken voices, mouths dripping with thread, each one missing a tongue. Prayot approached her slowly, dragging behind him a long rope of red silk. He wrapped it around her waist, around her throat, around her ankles. And when he finished, he leaned close. "You are almost mine." When she awoke, she could barely breathe. The thread around her wrist had doubled, no longer a single loop, but 7 tight coils. Her ankle was bleeding. She removed her pants to inspect it. There was a red indentation encircling it, as if someone had tied it in the night. She tried to cut the thread. She took a small pair of scissors from her bag and brought them to her wrist, but as the blade touched the string, it sparked, just faintly, like flint against stone. She pulled away with a gasp. Her skin had burned. She looked up and caught her reflection in the mirror again. This time it was smiling with teeth, rows of them, unnatural, small, needle-like, pressed behind her real teeth, glistening. She backed away, but the reflection didn't move. It watched and smiled wider. She screamed, but no sound came out. When she turned, her recorder sat on the table. The light was on. It was recording. She picked it up and pressed stop, then rewind, then play. Static, then breathing, then a voice. "The thread shortens. You will come to me, or I will come to you." She dropped the recorder. That night she went to the old shrine again, but it was empty, burned, blackened wood and ash, offerings scattered across the dirt. No shrine keeper, no statues, only the remnants of something purged. Someone had tried to stop it and failed. She walked back through the village, but it wasn't the same place anymore. Every house had its doors nailed shut. Salt was poured across thresholds. Red cloth covered the windows. The people hadn't left. They were hiding from her. A monk sat at the edge of the road, rocking gently. His eyes were white, blind. When she approached, he began to weep. "They never bury them right," he whispered. "The ones who die with love in their mouths, the ground spits them back." Karn knelt beside him. "Am I dead?" she asked. He smiled through tears. "No, you're being rewritten." The thread on her wrist twitched, hard, pulling her back toward the jungle. She stood and ran. She didn't want to, but her legs moved with panic she couldn't control. The thread tugged again. Her mouth opened involuntarily, and she giggled. Not laughter, not joy, a bride's giggle. Shrill, sweet, shivering. She slapped her hand over her mouth, horrified, but the sound kept coming, like something else was laughing through her. By the time she reached her room, her knees gave out. She collapsed beside the bed, sobbing, "I don't want this. I didn't mean to bring him." From the closet, something shifted, a soft rustling, then a soft footstep. She crawled toward the door, slowly. She reached out with trembling fingers and pulled it open. Empty, except a white robe hanging alone, not hers, stained with soil at the hem, and beside it, folded neatly, a burial veil. The air around her dropped in temperature. She could see her breath again. The red thread pulled once more, and the voice whispered in her ear, "One more night, then we are the same."
It began with music, faint at first, almost like the low whine of wind slipping through hollow bamboo. But Karn heard it clearly, echoing through her dreams, rising and falling in rhythm like breath. It was a melody from nowhere, something older than memory, a song she'd never heard before, but somehow knew the words to. She awoke to find herself already dressed. The veil lay folded at the foot of her bed. The white garment had draped itself over the chair in the corner. Her feet were bare but clean. The red thread around her wrist was gone. In its place was a ring. Not a real one. No gold, no silver. Just a circle of bruised skin wrapping around the base of her finger like a vow sealed in silence. She didn't scream. She didn't cry. She stood and followed the music. The jungle opened before her like a passage, vines parting at her steps, earth soft beneath her feet. The trees leaned inward, bowing. The path shimmered with a strange glow, as if moonlight had pooled into puddles along the trail. And at the end, where she knew it would be, stood the temple. No longer ruined, no longer forgotten. It had been made whole again. The pillars were straight, wrapped in white fabric. The altar shone under torchlight. Paper lanterns floated above the trees like glowing spirits, swaying gently without breeze. And they were waiting for her. Dozens of them, figures in white, faces obscured, each seated around a long stone table carved from the jungle floor. Their hands were still, their heads bowed. Before them, the offerings, bowls of rice gone cold, wilted lotus petals, broken combs, burned letters, small mirrors with no reflections. Karn stepped forward. None of them moved. Not yet. A hush fell across the clearing like the breath before a storm. And then he arrived. Prayat. His presence poured into the temple like mist, curling through the trees, stepping between the shadows. He did not walk. He entered as if the space had been made for him alone. His robes were no longer tattered. They gleamed, white stitched with red thread that coiled like veins across the fabric. His eyes were still covered, still bound, but he saw her. Somehow he saw her.
He raised a hand, and the veil lifted itself, drifting through the air to settle over Karn's head. A silent gasp rippled through the crowd of ghostly guests, and Karn moved forward, not walking, drifting. She stepped before him, and he reached out, not to hold her, but to place something gently into her hands, a spool of red thread, fresh, uncut. She didn't ask what it meant. She already knew. This was her part of the vow, to wind, to tie, to bind, around him, around herself, around everything she once was and could never be again. The guests began to move, slowly at first, hands rising, heads turning, mouths beginning to open. But no voices came, only the sound of threads tightening. One by one, the guests began to fade, dissolving into the air like smoke. Karn turned and realized they were never seated at the table. They were part of it. The stone shimmered where they had been, now revealing rows of names etched into its surface. Dozens of names, each one a bride, each one forgotten, until now. Karn's hands trembled, the veil grew heavier, and Prayat leaned close. "You are the last, and the first." His words didn't make sense, and yet they did. She understood what was happening now, not just a wedding, but a cycle, one that needed to close, one that had been waiting for her. Her lips parted to speak, but no sound came. Instead, she looked down and saw that the thread had wrapped itself around her body, coiled up her arms, her torso, her throat, not binding her to him, but to the altar. Prayat stepped back, the light dimmed, and Karn was alone. The guests were gone, the music had stopped, only the silence remained, and the thread, tightening, pulling downward, back toward the hollow beneath the altar. She tried to move, but her limbs were no longer hers. They obeyed something else now, a vow whispered in her sleep, a promise she never meant to keep. And yet, she felt no fear, only a slow, aching warmth, like sinking into water, like remembering a lullaby. She closed her eyes, and the earth opened beneath her.
Karn woke on the temple floor, face pressed against the cold stone, her mouth dry, her hands raw. The red thread had vanished, the veil was gone. But the memory of the wedding feast clung to her like smoke, no taste, no sound, and yet somehow still inside her. She sat up slowly, body aching, throat sore. Outside, the sun had not risen. It never did anymore. The sky was pale, but lifeless. The trees swayed in rhythms she didn't recognize. And the village felt farther away, like she had crossed an invisible threshold and could no longer go back. Still, something in her pulled downward, toward the altar, toward the stone, toward the soil. She approached it not with fear, but with quiet inevitability, as if she had always been meant to finish what had begun generations ago. The altar was warm, not with heat, with presence. She knelt beside it, running her fingers along the cracks in the foundation, feeling the hum beneath the stone. The breathing had not stopped. It had only grown quieter, more certain, like whatever lived beneath it no longer needed to hide. A soft clicking sound echoed beneath her palm, like bones shifting. She swallowed hard and began clearing the space behind the altar where the roots had split the stone. The hollow beneath had widened since her first visit, What had once been a small crevice was now a shallow tunnel, just wide enough for a person to crawl through. She hesitated, then crawled inside. The air grew colder as she descended, the light from the entrance dimming until only a pale red glow remained, pulsing from deeper within the earth. The passage twisted sharply and then opened into a chamber, hidden beneath the temple, a chamber of forgotten things. It was not empty. Karn gasped. Dozens of objects filled the small room, scattered offerings from past rituals, items once precious, now coated in dust and sorrow. Bracelets, dolls, hair combs, prayer scrolls, broken mirrors, and bundles of red thread, each knotted and fraying. In the center stood a single wooden coffin, propped upright against the far wall. It had been split down the middle, from the inside. Faint red lines had been painted across the chamber walls, not random, ritualistic. Karn stepped closer and recognized the same script from the manuscript, the same characters etched again and again into the wood and stone. At the base of the coffin, she found something wrapped in white silk. She knelt, hands trembling, and unwrapped it. Inside were names, written on scraps of paper, charcoal faded but still visible. Each name was followed by a date, each date decades apart. Each name belonged to a woman, and at the bottom of the pile, her own name, Karn. The ink was still wet. She stared at it in horror, her heart thudding. She hadn't written this, but someone had, recently. She turned suddenly as something shifted behind her, a sound not of breath, but of silence parting. The chamber seemed to sigh, and then a voice, not in her ears, but in her bones. You were not the first to tie the thread. She turned slowly, eyes searching the dark. You were just the first to choose it. A figure stood at the far end of the room now, just past the coffin. Not Prayat, another, a woman, her face veiled, her hands bound in red thread. She swayed gently, as though still dancing to a rhythm long forgotten. Karn opened her mouth, but the woman raised a finger to her lips, and then faded, leaving only the scent of wilted jasmine behind. Karn turned back toward the pile of offerings and noticed something she hadn't seen before, a small lacquered box tucked between the stones. She opened it. Inside, preserved with care, was a baby's anklet, tiny, silver, engraved, the kind given to a firstborn child. Attached to it was a torn page. Karn unfolded it, her hands trembling. The script was shakier, but legible. It was a confession from one of the previous brides, not a ritual bride, a real one. The letter told of a village girl taken to the temple during a season of famine, chosen, promised safety for her family. She was told that she would marry a spirit and that her bloodline would be protected, that the temple demanded an heir, but not one of flesh, one of faith, a girl to continue the ritual, a girl to carry the thread into the next generation. But the ritual failed, the girl fled, and the famine returned. It ended with a line scrawled in desperation. I buried her beneath the altar. I had no choice. Forgive me. The blood must bind, or the dead will walk. Karn stumbled back, dizzy. She understood now. She was never meant to escape. The thread wasn't just a binding, it was a summons. The ritual had called her long before she ever arrived. Her research, her loneliness, her curiosity, they were only the path. The thread had led her, slowly, softly, across time. Not to study, to fulfill. She climbed out of the chamber, hands and knees coated in ash and soil. Back in the temple, The altar had changed. The stone was cleaner, as if freshly cut. A new offering bowl had appeared, this one empty, waiting, and beside it, another veil, fresh, white, unworn. She stared at it, and then turned away, and ran. The bus to Chiang Kong left at dawn. Karn didn't remember packing. She didn't remember walking to the edge of Thung. Only the weight of her bag across her shoulders and the way the sky refused to brighten, even as morning arrived. No one stopped her. Not the villagers, not the spirits, not even Prayot. But the silent clung to her like wet cloth, as if something unseen followed just out of reach, waiting. It took her half a day to cross the river into Laos, then deeper inland by motorbike taxi to a roadside shop that wasn't on any official map. The locals called it the house with no walls, just a faded wooden structure with open beams, wind chimes made from bones, and red talismans fluttering like tongues in the wind. Inside sat a man in white, wrinkled, barefoot, eyes closed. The others called him Ajahn Neng. When Karn stepped forward, he opened his eyes and began to cry. "You've tied the string," he said softly, "and now you want to cut it." Karn sat on the wooden floor, her voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to. I didn't know what it would take." He shook his head. "That doesn't matter. The vow is older than your intent." She reached into her bag and placed the spool of red thread on the floor between them. It twitched. Just once. Ajahn Neng did not touch it. He reached behind him and brought out a bundle wrapped in cloth. Inside were mirrors, old, cracked, some blackened with age. He spread them in a circle around her, muttering in a dialect she didn't understand. Then he handed her one. "Look." She hesitated. "I've already seen." "No," he interrupted gently. "This time, look with both eyes open." She raised the mirror, and the breath left her body. The reflection was her face, but it was no longer hers. The skin was pale, drained of warmth. Her lips were dark, as if painted with ash, and the smile, the same too wide smile she had seen in dreams, curved up without moving her muscles. Behind the reflection, something moved. A figure, tall, dressed in white burial robes, hands clasped, head bowed. Prayot. He stood behind her reflection, invisible in the real room, but present in the glass. Ajahn Neng lit a candle and placed it before her. The flame flickered 3 times, then went still. "You've already begun to host him," he said. "He's not beside you anymore. He's inside." Karn's fingers trembled. "How do I stop it?" He took out a coil of white thread, different from her own, simple, untainted, used for banishing spirits. "There's one way, but it's dangerous." "I don't care." "You must confront a part of you that welcomed him." Karn frowned. "What do you mean?" "You must look into the mirror and speak the truth, the part of you that opened the door, the part that called him." The room darkened as clouds swallowed the light. Wind rushed through the walls, rattling every charm.
Ajahn Neng chanted louder, tying the white thread around her wrist as he placed a mirror directly in front of her face. "Now," he whispered, "call your name." Karn hesitated. The mirror pulsed faintly. Her reflection blinked first. She hadn't blinked. Her lips parted. Not hers. Not anymore. She stared at the glass and said, "My name is Karn." The reflection smiled wider. Not anymore. Ajahn Neng's chant grew louder, trembling with urgency. The thread around her wrist tightened, glowing faintly. "Tell him to leave," he shouted. Karn faced the mirror. "You don't belong in me. This is my body. You can't stay." But the reflection only tilted its head, amused, then spoke. "You asked for me." The room went silent. Ajahn Neng's chanting stopped. Karn turned to him. His eyes were wide with horror. "What did you do?" he whispered. She tried to answer, but her mouth moved without permission, and from it came a voice not her own. "She called. I came. I was patient. I waited through generations. She is mine." The mirror shattered, every single one. The wind roared, the candles died. When the smoke cleared, Ajahn Neng was gone. No blood, no body, just salt. And Karn alone. The white thread on her wrist had turned red. Outside, the wind had stopped. She stood in the empty shop, her breath shallow, her reflection now scattered across the shards on the floor. Each fragment smiled at her. Each fragment watched her. She knelt slowly, picked up a piece of mirror, and saw his eyes in place of hers. By the time Karn returned to Thung, 3 days had passed. But the village looked as if 3 decades had fallen on it. Roofs sagged, doors hung open or not at all. Offerings once placed carefully at shrines now lay overturned, spoiled by wind and rot. The air was brittle, dry, like parchment left too long in sun. No one came to greet her. No one watched from behind the windows. There was no longer anyone to hide. Karn stepped onto the path without shoes. She had lost them somewhere near the border. Her feet were calloused now, darkened by soil, as if the ground itself had begun to accept her. The white thread had turned red. The red had darkened to black. And still it pulled. Shorter now, so tight it cut into her wrist with every movement. The skin beneath it pulsed, throbbed, beat like a second heart. She no longer dreamed, or if she did, she could no longer tell where the dreams ended and waking began. At night, the wind called her name. During the day, the trees answered back. She whispered to no one, but someone always replied. The guest house was empty. The old woman's altar was broken, her amulets scattered like dried seeds. On the wall, written in black soot, was a single phrase. She chose the knot. Karn didn't flinch. She walked to the mirror near the door, not to check her appearance, but to see how far it had gone. Her face still resembled her own, but only in shape. The eyes were no longer brown. They had deepened into a shade of red so faint it might have been imagined except for the light they reflected. Her skin had grown paler, not sickly, hollowed. But the smile was worst. It came without summoning now, permanent, gentle, like it knew something she hadn't yet accepted. She lifted her shirt. There, across her ribs, were small red marks. Not scars, not bruises. Stitches. Tidy, even, sewn in thread that looped across her skin like a ritual completed in secret. Something had been added or removed. She didn't want to know which. That evening, she walked to the temple. The path had narrowed, as if the jungle itself wanted to keep her. Trees leaned closer. The red sky hung low, heavy with smoke. Birds no longer sang. She reached the altar just after sunset. The thread pulled tight and snapped. Not with violence, but with certainty. As if the ritual had been completed. She waited. The altar exhaled, and then he rose. Prayat, not as a vision, not in mirrors, but real. His feet touched the stone now. His robes moved with the wind. The threads over his eyes were gone, and in their place were eyes that had never belonged to the living. Deep, unending, sad, and full of possession. He opened his arms. Karn did not run. There was nowhere left inside her to flee to. "You are finished," he said softly. And she nodded. Yes. He stepped forward and touched her chest with 2 fingers. The threads over her ribs tightened, sank beneath the skin. The smile deepened, and Karn fell, not to the ground, but inward, into silence, into soil, into a name that was no longer hers. And from her mouth came a whisper, spoken in a voice that wasn't quite hers. "I am the thread. I am the bride. I am the gate." That night, the villagers who remained, those hiding beneath floorboards, those whispering prayers from childhood, heard a sound rising from the temple. Not screams, not chanting. Laughter. Soft, gentle, playful. A bride's laugh. It echoed down the mountainside and into their bones, and they knew. She had become the final offering. The last thread had been tied, and now the door could not be closed. Karn awoke in the dark. Not the kind of dark that came with night, not the soft black behind closed eyelids. This was a darkness without dimension, without edges. It had weight. It pressed against her chest, her limbs, her eyes. It was inside her as much as around her. The air was cold, wet, full of soil. Her fingers moved first, barely. They brushed against earth, coarse and damp, packed tightly around her. She was underground, buried, alive. But she did not panic. She did not scream, because something deeper than fear had settled inside her now. Acceptance. She lay still, letting her thoughts rise like mist. Her memories were intact, but distant, as though they belonged to someone else. A girl who had studied folklore. a girl who had come looking for truth in the bones of a temple, a girl who once had a name. What was her name? It came slowly, softly. Karn. Yes, but even that felt temporary. Something in the soil shifted, a breath, a presence. The earth did not just surround her, it listened, it waited. She raised her hand, the thread around her wrist was gone. In its place, her veins glowed faintly red beneath the skin. Not blood. Thread, spun from inside her. She opened her mouth. The air was thick, but it flowed in like water. The silence answered. Then she heard it. Footsteps, not above, not below, within. They echoed not in her ears, but in her chest. And then his voice. You have been claimed. A soft glow bloomed before her, pale red, like the afterimage of a flame behind closed eyes. It took shape slowly. Frayat, but not as before. He was no longer shrouded in ritual, no longer a figure draped in silence. Here, beneath the altar, he was raw, human, spirit, God. None of those things, all of them. His face was beautiful and hollow, like something unfinished. He stepped forward and knelt beside her. His hand reached down and touched her chest. The stitches along her ribs pulsed with light. You carry the vow now, he said. Karn tried to speak, but no sound came, only a feeling, a memory. She was dancing, in another life, wrapped in silk, her hands bound in red ribbon, surrounded by monks who watched but never blinked. She had done this before, not once, not twice, but many times. This wasn't a single story, it was a loop, and now she had taken her place in it. She was the bride, she was the offering, she was the door that could no longer close. Frayat leaned close, whispering into her skin. They buried me alive, but now I rise in you. The soil shifted around them, revealing walls lined with bones, not stacked, not abandoned, arranged, as if they had formed a cathedral beneath the earth. Each skull bore the mark of a thread around the jaw. Each hand clutched a doll, a ring, a ribbon. Each was a bride who had come before, and now they all watched her, their sockets empty but aware. Karn felt her breath slow, her skin cool, her heart still but unbroken. She closed her eyes and whispered, I understand. Frayat smiled. You were not meant to fight this, you were meant to carry it forward. The soil around her rose, gently, embracing her. The bones returned to silence. The red light dimmed, and Karn sank into the earth, not with fear, but with purpose. That night, Thung fell silent. The air was still. The jungle held its breath. And then, just before dawn, soft laughter drifted from the temple grounds. A new offering appeared on the altar. A folded white veil, a spool of red thread, and beneath it all, a journal, weathered, unfinished. Its final page read, She didn't vanish, she became the ritual. And beneath that, in handwriting not Karn's, a second line appeared. She is ready to be remembered. She arrived on the last bus before the fog rolled in. Just another researcher, young,
tired, bright eyes dulled by too many screens and too few answers. She wore boots made for fieldwork and a satchel heavy with maps, notebooks, and questions no one else seemed to care about. Her name was Rin. She had come to Thung for the same reason Karn once had: folklore, forgotten temples, the way stories whispered through generations long after the dead stopped speaking. But no one welcomed her, not even the land. The fog hung thick and low, curling around her ankles like a warning. The air was dense with something sweet and unpleasant, like incense left too long in a sealed room. Rin stepped off the bus and glanced down at her notes. She had circled the name Wat Ban Tung with red ink, but no one she asked spoke of it. "Old ground," said one villager, staring straight ahead. "Nothing left," muttered another. "Go home." But she didn't. Instead, she found the guest house, boarded up, dust-covered, a place suspended in silence. Still, the door creaked open when she pushed. Inside, the air was cold, too cold. She unpacked quickly, lit a single candle, and opened her laptop. No signal, no map, no coordinates. Only the echo of something pulling, a thread she couldn't name. Later, as the candle flickered, she explored the room. Under the floorboard, she found a small black recorder, still functioning, still warm. She pressed play. Static, then a voice. Karn's voice. Day 3. The thread is changing. Rin sat upright. Another voice followed, faint, male, soft as breath. You tied it wrong. She dropped the recorder. The candle dimmed, and something outside whispered her name. The next morning, Rin made her way through the jungle. She followed no path, only instinct. The deeper she walked, the more the trees leaned inward, closing ranks around her. Vines brushed her cheeks like hands. She stumbled across broken stone, half-buried steps, fragments of carvings. Then she saw it. Wat Ban Tung, or what remained. The temple was in ruins, but not abandoned. Offerings still sat upon the altar, fresh, white lotus petals, a string of prayer beads, a folded veil, and beneath them, a journal. She picked it up carefully, brushing off soil. The cover was soft leather, etched faintly with a name, Karn. She opened it slowly, fingers trembling. The pages began with notes, observations about temple rituals, symbols, local dialects. Then sketches, symbols, translations. Then handwriting that changed, slanted, shaky. Pages filled with questions, then silence, then something else. A drawing, a man in robes, eyes sewn shut, red thread across his chest, and beneath it, written with care, "He is not a ghost. He is a groom." Rin closed the journal. Her breath came short. The air felt too still. She turned toward the altar and froze. Someone had placed a mirror at its base. It was cracked, but intact. She stepped forward and gazed into it. At first, she saw only herself, but slowly, too slowly, her reflection began to smile. A smile that did not match the weight in her chest, too wide, too still. She stepped back, heart pounding. Her reflection remained, watching, smiling, waiting. Then it blinked, once, slowly, and Rin ran.
That night, she returned to the guest house, clutching Karn's journal to her chest. She could not explain why she didn't burn it, or bury it, or leave. She simply couldn't. The recorder sat on the table, still playing. Now it whispered things she didn't recognize. A lullaby in a dialect she didn't speak, but her lips began to hum along. Her reflection in the darkened window followed every word, and when she finally slept, the dream came. Soft white silk, lanterns floating above trees, a long stone table set with empty bowls, and at the far end, a man in white, eyes covered in thread, holding out a red string that stretched toward her wrist. She didn't move, but her dream self smiled and took the string. They say the fog never leaves Thung, that once, many lifetimes ago, it was a place of joy, fields that hummed with bees, monks who sang to the rice, villagers who danced in white under moonlight. But then came the famine, the silence, the offerings, and the thread. Always the thread. No one remembers when the temple was first built. No one remembers who carved its altar or who first buried the boy beneath its stone. But they remember what came after. They remember the brides. They remember the veil. They remember the laughter, soft and hollow, that echoes from the forest when the air turns cold. And now they remember her. Karn, the outsider who came searching for answers and gave herself instead. Not in fear, not even in sacrifice, but in surrender. Because the thread never pulls the unwilling. It waits. It watches. And when the moment is right, it wraps itself gently around the heart until you no longer remember what it felt like to be alone. Some nights, the villagers still gather in silence, though none of them speak of the temple anymore. They light candles. They place salt along the thresholds. They tie white thread around their children's wrists, not red, never red, and whisper old lullabies in broken dialects. The elders no longer tell stories, because in Thung, stories are dangerous. They are doors, and someone is always listening. In the jungle, the path has disappeared again, overgrown, swallowed, gone. But if you follow the fog just right, if you arrive at the edge of the tree line during the 7th moon of the dry season, you might hear it, the faint sound of a bell, swaying, even without wind. And if you keep walking, if you don't turn back, you may find the ruins of a temple, or perhaps the temple finds you. It depends on who's asking. Inside, the altar remains, cracked, old, patient. But on certain nights, when the light is just soft enough and the shadows lean too long, you'll see them, offerings, still fresh, still warm. A spool of red thread, a folded white veil, and beside them, a journal, open to its last page. Words appear slowly, faint at first, as if written by a hand that no longer belongs to the living. She didn't vanish. She became the ritual. She became the memory. She became the door. And behind you, always behind you, a whisper. The thread is never truly cut.